Welcome to our viewers. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland, College Park. Today's lecture is co-sponsored with the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative and the Department of African American Studies. First and foremost, I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, for organizing today's event. And of course, it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Williams, whom I will introduce to you momentarily. But first, I have to go over a few technical stuff. Upon joining this virtual meeting, you are muted and your video is off. This program is being recorded. By participating in this virtual meeting, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions at the end of the talk when you can go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and write your question down for Dr. Williams. So our program today is a continuation of the Bahá'í Chair's exploration of America's history with its Confederate past. Although the Civil War ended now over 150 years ago, the ideas and activities of the Confederacy continue to shape how we experience our present moment. Today's talk is also a part of our ongoing series on structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. Of course, this is a very important and complex topic, and I'm so pleased that we have Dr. Jhacova Williams to take us through this difficult and complex topic. Dr. Williams is an associate economist at the Rand Corporation. She is an applied microeconomist focusing primarily on economic history and cultural economics. Her previous work has examined Southern culture and the extent to which historical events have impacted political behavior and economic outcomes of Southern Black people. Recent examples include historical lynchings and the political participation of Black people, and the Confederate symbols and labor market differentials. She has also done a series of projects investigating the role of structural racism in shaping racial economic disparities in labor markets. Her work has used various research designs to assess causal effects. Her work is unique because, as she would say herself, most economists do not dwell into these areas, which she so professionally and wonderfully dwells into. And for that, we are grateful for her work. Dr. Williams received her PhD from Louisiana State University, and the title of her talk today is Confederate Streets and Black-White Labor Market Differentials. It is my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Dr. Huda, and thank you, Dr. Seaman, for putting this together. I truly appreciate being here. It's a pleasure. I'm actually a graduate of University of Maryland as well, so always great to be back on campus, right? And we'll pretend as if I'm there, but love it, love Maryland. So I'm gonna share my screen, and sorry, 1 second, let's just make this large, perfect. So just as Dr. Huda said, I'm going to talk today about Confederate Streets and Black-White labor market differentials. I would actually say that I was motivated to write this paper and to do this research because of the 2015 killing in which Dylan Roof went into a Black church and killed 9 churchgoers. After that killing, a lot of people started talking about Confederate symbols. In particular, there was a huge focus on Confederate monuments, but I'll show you guys in a second. There's Confederate monuments, there's streets, there's flags, there's parks, there's holidays, there's schools. How do I know this? because I'm from New Orleans. That's where the beautiful accent comes from. And New Orleans, like a lot of southern states, but across the United States, have a lot of Confederate symbols. The middle school that I went to was named Thurgood Marshall, but 2 years prior, it was named Beauregard. And so we have a lot of streets, a lot of schools named after Confederate generals. We have counties named after Confederate generals. It's like a huge heat map. And so after this killing, a lot of people started talking about all of these symbols and started just asking, what do these things mean? Why are they here? And you have two sides of the coin. You have some people who believe, hey, this is just Southern heritage. That's all it is. We are Southerners. We don't like Yankees. And so we just want to talk about Southern pride. And you have another group of individuals who say, hey, no, these are just racist symbols. Flat out racist, it is what it is. And so after this killing, I started saying there had to be a way in which I could quantify that. And so I actually, again, started working on this paper. So again, I have some pictures here just so you can see that there's Lee Circle. That's one big street that's in New Orleans. You have monuments, again, flags. One picture that I want to point out in particular is this picture that is in the lower right-hand corner. This picture should look very strange to you, right? And I would say three things. Number one, it's taken at night. It isn't too strange, right? Taking down this monument, bulletproof vests, and they have helmets. Should you ask yourself, why are they doing it that way? Well, this is actually in New Orleans, and shortly after the killings, the mayor at the time actually decided we're going to take these monuments down. Something is going on. We shouldn't have these things erected, blah, blah, blah. Well, he and other individuals released the name of the contractor who was contracted to take these monuments down. And shortly after that, that contractor's Lamborghini was bombed. I want you to hear what I just said. The contractor's Lamborghini was bombed. And so what that means is that, hey, they said, you know what? The contractor pulled out. They had to get a new contractor and then decided we're not going to release who the contractor is. And we're not going to even say when we do it. But they had to do it at night, and they wanted to protect the individuals who took this Confederate monument down. So needless to say that some people are very serious about these Confederate symbols. And again, there's two different arguments. And so the claim that I'm going to make is that symbols can be studied by cultural economics and labor economics. And I'll talk about what that means to be a cultural economist. Dr. Huda actually said that, and I always like to say I'm a very different type of economist. Economists usually like to shy away from race, and in particular racism. And I like to hit it dead on. And specifically what I'm going to do in this research paper is examine whether or not an area's measure of racist symbols are associated with Black-white labor market differentials. So how do we actually define something as being a racist symbol? My research design is actually going to say I'm going to proxy and I'm going to use streets named after prominent Confederate generals as a measure of racist symbols. And we'll talk about why I think that that's a good measure of racist symbols. Remember, again, there's two different arguments. Hey, this is just Southern history. Other individuals, this is racist. And so I have to show that it's related to something that is racist, right? And I'm going to show you that in a second. Preview of my findings. What do I find? Waha, there is a relationship. It only makes sense that there's a relationship. That's why I'm here speaking, right? That's why there is a paper. I actually show where there's a relatively higher number of streets named after Confederate generals, or just Confederate streets, I'll call it, that Blacks do worse in terms of labor market outcomes. They are less likely to be employed, more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and have lower wages compared to their white counterparts. Now, the thing that's interesting about these Confederate symbols, and specifically I'm looking at Confederate streets, the thing that's really interesting about this is that if they are indeed racist symbols, you would expect that individuals who are non-white, that are also not Black, that there should be some relationship with their labor market outcomes. And you see that that's the case. The results extend to other minority groups. In particular, I show that same relationships you see exist for Hispanics compared to whites, Asians compared to whites, and foreign-born individuals compared to whites, right? What's very interesting about these results is that if you look at all of these groups, Asians in particular are the model minority, right? And what I mean by that is some people actually say that, hey, they're the model minority in a sense that they have higher employment propensities and higher wages compared to whites. But you see that when they live in these areas also that have a relatively higher number of Confederate streets, that they also have worse labor market outcomes, right? So to just kind of give an outline of my talk, I'm going to give a historical background, conceptual framework, empirical framework, data results, and finally conclude. And so, yes, I'm a cultural economist, and I'm an economic historian. Economic historian just means I talk about history, right? Which is also a very small subfield in econ, but it is a field. So if you're interested in econ, We all are not people who talk about monetary policy. That's always great to talk about, but there's also econ history. What history am I going to talk about? Well, obviously, American history, right? Southern history, and something that actually has to do with Black people. And in particular, I want to first talk about this, the 1850s time period. And what I would say is that you actually had different opinions from northern states and southern states around the 1850s. And there were three things in particular that kind of had them coming at odds with each other. The first was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And basically, this was an act that said that any runaway slave that was caught in the North, that they had to return to their Southern owner. The second was a depiction of slavery in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this was actually just a hard book at the time that actually really showed and talked about the brutality, the torture of slavery. And then the third thing was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So Kansas-Nebraska was a new territory in which you had individuals coming from the North and the South settling. And you have people from the South saying we should expand slavery to this new territory. And you have people from the North saying, no, we shouldn't. And so you have these three different things that happened in the 1850s. And because of this, all eyes were on the 1860 presidential election. Why is that the case? Because Abraham Lincoln was running for president and he argued against slavery. Now I want to make it very clear, he did not say that he was going to end slavery, but he just said, hey, something's wrong with that. It's a strange institution. Something's weird about it. You know, those Southerners do it, but it's strange, right? And you had John Breckinridge that argued for the protection and expansion of slavery. And because of these different views, again, between the North and the South, Southerners said, hey, listen, if that guy Abraham Lincoln wins, we're out. We're out. We're separating from the United States. We're going to create our own Confederate States. We have our own president, right? Because we want to continue slavery, right? So what happens? 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins. The Southern states made good on their promise. They succeed from the Union in the 1860s and 1861. And I know that a lot of people talk now and say, hey, this whole secession from the Union actually had more to do with states' rights. I would say it didn't actually really have anything to do with states' rights, but even if we say it had something to do with states' rights, it was states' rights to own slaves, right? So it still had something to do with states' rights, quote unquote. And I would say that this is the case because 5 of the 11 states explicitly mention slavery in their ordinances of secession. And the remaining 6 states actually had representatives that talked about how integral slavery was to their economy, right? So they actually said, this is the reason why we are seceding from the Union. What happens? They secede from the Union, American Civil War happens, it starts in 1861, it lasts for 4 years, it is a very bloody war, over 600,000 individuals were killed. The Confederacy eventually concedes to the Union, and then Confederate generals were commemorated with streets, schools, parks, museums, flags, statues, counties. I mean, a whole host of things. And the thing that's interesting about this is that a lot of these commemorations were not around, say, the 1860 time period. You see a lot of this happen in the 1920s and the 1960s, and I'll talk about why I think that's the case later. Right? So conceptual framework. So I've given you a little bit of my historical background. That's my econ history head. All right, but I would actually say cultural economics kind of deals a lot with behavioral economics and psychology. And so what I'm going to do is build on psychology. And actually, psychologists have actually found that symbols can be used to connect past and present generations, right? How is that the case? Because they can be used to express and maintain cultural narratives and reflect feelings of hatred or oppression. So I have 3 symbols here, right? And I just have them here just because, again, if you see these symbols, they use to express something, some idea. So if you see the cross, you assume that this person is a Christian. I put the infinity sign because I was a former mathematician. Again, I graduated from Maryland in the applied mathematics department. And then I have this last symbol, which is quirky, but I put that there for a reason because I didn't want to nod to it. But the point is that we would all agree that that is a symbol of anti-Semitic racism, right? So, anti-Semitic views. So now cultural economics. Again, how am I weaving all of this together? What is cultural economics? It is a small subfield in behavioral economics. And basically what we're saying is this: econ is really a decision-making science, right? We're trying to understand why people behave certain ways, why they decide to consume, why they decide to save, how goods are distributed, resources, all of these different things. And so what cultural economics is, well, what if people make certain decisions based on culture, right? What if it actually has something to do with history, right? And so with cultural economics, and in particular cultural economics that I study, is racism. What I say is, hey, what if racism does exist? Waha, wink, wink, I think it does, right? What if there is racist culture? And what if that culture is persistent? And so you have three papers that I'll just talk about that kind of talk about this. The first is Volander and Volt, and they actually talk about anti-Semitic views. And so they find a positive relationship between violence against Jews and the Black Death. And so what they actually argue in this paper is that the Black Death occurred in the 1300s. And about 1/3 of Europe's population died during this time period. And some people say Black Death or Black Plague. And for whatever reason, there was no evidence of this or whatever, but for whatever reason during this time period, people blamed Jewish people and said, hey, they poisoned the whales. They're the reason why people are dying. And people went during this time period in the 1300s and started attacking Jews, killing them. A lot of violence, right, erupted. And so what they actually find is that if you fast forward 500 years later, that those same areas that were killing and attacking Jewish people, they were more likely to attack Jewish people during Hitler's reign, and they were more likely to actually vote for Hitler, right, to actually support that party. The second paper that I'll talk about that actually talks about and deals a little bit with culture is Achari et al. In 2016. They find that political attitudes among Southern whites can be related to the prevalence of slavery. And so in particular, what they do is they actually proxy slavery by looking at the percentage of individuals who were enslaved during the 1860 time period. And they show that counties that had a higher prevalence of slaves, a higher share of slaves during that time period, that they are more likely to oppose affirmative action and more likely to admit that they hold some type of racial resentment towards Blacks. Right. The last paper I'll talk about is my paper. I'll toot my paper's horn. I have a paper that talks about lynchings in the contemporary voting behavior of Blacks. In particular, I hypothesize that during the 1860 time period, Black men were given the right to vote. They voted in vast numbers. Nearly 90% of Black men during the time period voted. And when they voted, they changed the political structure of the South. And so what happened? Historical lynchings arose. And so what I actually say is that those events actually created a behavior patterns among Blacks, those racist events, that was passed down from generation to generation. And so in that paper, I showed that Blacks who currently reside in areas that had a relatively higher number of lynchings, that they are less likely to indicate that they voted in an election and are less likely to register for an election compared to their white counterparts. Right? So that's a mouthful. What am I saying with all of this? Putting all of this together. What I am basically saying is that individuals who have power, right? My whole conceptual framework and what Confederate symbols have to do with this is that individuals have power. They have the power to name these streets. They have the power to erect these symbols, to name these schools, right? These individuals probably held some type of racist attitudes towards Blacks. And if that is the case, then they also probably could enact policies that outlive them, which are related to labor market differentials that exist between Blacks and whites, right? So that is my conceptual framework, which is kind of connecting the past, and I should say kind of, but is connecting the past to the present. All right, so I said I was going to talk about why I thought that Confederate Streets were a good proxy for racist symbols. Why do I think that I could actually say that these are racist symbols? So what I'm doing here is actually plotting the relationship between Confederate Streets and something that I think everyone would say was definitely a racist act, and that was the lynchings of Black individuals. And so on my x-axis, I have the number of Blacks who were lynched, and then on my y-axis, I have the number of streets named after prominent Confederate generals. And this is actually normalized by the total number of streets, right? So for people who are like, hey, listen, what are all those dots? That is actually just a grouping of several dots. So it's actually way more dots than this, but I'm actually doing what's called a bin scatter plot. And it's just clustering these things together to create a better visualization for people to see. But the overall thing that I want you to take from this is, what do you see? Something that's increasing, something that's sloped upward. What does that mean? This is actually saying that counties that lynched more Blacks in the past currently have more streets named after Confederate generals today. All right, so you see this positive relationship between lynchings in the past and current areas that have streets named after prominent Confederate generals, right? I can even look at the mileage of the street, all right? Because if you've ever been to New Orleans, one street that is a very long street in New Orleans is Jefferson Davis. All right, and so it may actually matter. It may not even be just the number of streets, but maybe even the length of these streets. Maybe that even matters. Maybe that's more power, right? And what do you see here again? Still that upward sloping line, that positive relationship. So I'm actually still showing that there's this still relationship between historical lynchings and the mileage of streets that are named after Confederate generals. Now, that might just be some hocus pocus, right? That might just be by chance that I'm finding this positive relationship. So what I do next is what's called a falsification exercise in econ. And so I want to say like, okay, well, I see that there's this positive relationship, right? What else could I see if it's related to that it should not be related to? And I want to see if that's the case. And so now I want to see if lynchings are related to streets named after Revolutionary War commanders. The reason why I choose this is because I say, okay, well, this is another war in history. And this war really didn't have much to do with race, right? Some people may say it had a little bit, but it wasn't really necessarily founded on race. The Civil War, totally different story. We could definitely talk about all of the racial implications that it had. And so now I want to see if areas that actually have streets named after Revolutionary War commanders, and again, looking at the number and looking at the mileage of the street, just like I did with Confederate streets, is that related to the number of Blacks who were lynched in the past? What do you see? A flat line. What is that saying? No relationship. These estimates are very, very, very close to zero, which is why you see this flat line, and they are statistically insignificant. So again, notice how you're seeing this positive relationship here, statistically significant as well, but you're seeing this zero relationship here and statistically insignificant. So you are seeing, and just flipping back and forth, that Confederate streets are related to lynchings, but lynchings are not related to revolutionary streets named after Revolutionary War commanders. Right? So that's the first thing that I do to establish, hey, there is something here, right? There is something here. Now, because I am an economist and I'm an empirical economist, meaning that I love data. And for people who don't like data, don't worry, we are going to walk through this together, right? That's just what I love to do. And so my data, I'm going to look at states in the former Confederacy. And I also include Kentucky only because they voted a lot with these states. And so generally in the literature, people include Kentucky. And so I'm including Kentucky as well. My outcome variables. Remember, I want to see whether or not these areas that have more Confederate streets, right? If Blacks are performing worse in the labor market. And so in particular, I want something that has to do with the labor market. I want to look at people's employment propensities, right? So I have an indicator for whether or not a person is employed or not. I have a person's occupation. And so I actually have 6 different bar categories, and I have an occupational status indicator. I'm going to say that someone is in a low status occupation if there are any of these occupations that are in red. And I'm going to say that they have a high occupation status if they are in any of these 3 that are in black, right? The next thing I want to do is look at hourly wage. And again, all of this is coming from 2011 to 2015. And so this will just be income divided by weeks times hours worked to compute someone's hourly wage from this survey data. And so this data also has a public use micro area, which you could look at like an MSA. So bigger than a county, sometimes it can contain 1 county, but for the most part, it's more than 1 county. And so I know in individuals, again, whether or not they're employed, I know their occupation, I can compute their wage, and I know where they reside and where they work, right? And so I have all of this information on all of these states. Now, my main explanatory variable, why is this really a paper? The unique part of this paper is that I created a measure of Confederate streets. Now, I am not that fancy, right? So I didn't go by hand in different counties to figure this out. The good thing is that the data were out there. I just needed to figure out how to create the data set. So the census actually has these things called tiger shapefiles at the county level. And they have them every year, but I choose 2015. And this is because the killing occurred in 2015, right? That I talked about at the very beginning. And you have some people talking about changing streets and all of that nature. So I want to get kind of a really good proxy of how many streets were named after Confederate generals. So what this data contains are the full name of streets, right? For every street in the United States, every county, right? And you can go and actually download all of this information. Because it has the full name of streets, what that means is that it won't necessarily just have Robert E. Lee, who's the Confederate general, right? It would actually have East Robert E. Lee Boulevard. So what I have to do is create some type of procedure to identify that as a Confederate street. And so it's twofold procedure. First thing I want to do is see if the full name of a street actually has the first name of a Confederate general. Then I want to see if it has the last name of a Confederate general. If it has the first and last name, I say, yes, that is a Confederate street. All right, so again, if it has Robert and Lee, that is Robert E. Lee Boulevard. or street or drive or parkway or avenue or highway, right? Jefferson and Davis, right? That is Jefferson Davis, who was not a Confederate general, but was the president. So I also include him as well of the Confederacy. Now, some people may hear that and say, that's a little restrictive because you're saying the first and last name. But remember, I told you at the very beginning, Lee Circle is a very big street in New Orleans, right? That is named after Robert E. Lee. Well, the reason why I'm doing that is because what I don't want to do is over-identify streets named after Confederate generals, right? And there might be a street named after Bruce Lee. I don't know, right? And so I want to make sure that I'm actually only identifying streets named as after Confederate generals. And so you can look at everything that I have from here on out when I show results as lower bounds, right? At least we know that this is the relationship. We know that it actually may be greater in magnitude, but it's at least what I'm saying. All right, so I have that data. And what I need to do is actually assign that to individuals based on where they live. Remember, I have this PUMA level, which is similar to MSA, but my Confederate street data comes at the county level, which is a lower level of geography. And so long story short, what I really do is actually use a mapping. Again, not something I create, but something I actually take from a website, which is great. It provides a mapping from county to PUMA with an allocation factor. And so what it tells me is, hey, this percentage of this county is contained in this PUMA. And what I'm going to use is that allocation factor to actually assign and to create a PUMA level measure of Confederate streets. So my main explanatory variable instead is going to be the number of Confederate streets per 1,000 total streets at the PUMA level. So again, at what's equivalent to MSA level. Right. So descriptive statistics, I know this is a big chart, but I always like to show everything. And that's only because I deal with economists. If you've never dealt with economists, they are crazy people, even though I am one. And if you don't show them all of this stuff, they'll swear to God that you're hiding something. I'm not hiding anything, right? But I do want to just point out a few things just to see. Again, I have these individual level controls for Blacks, and I have it for whites as well, right? So I can see that in my sample, about 88% of Blacks are employed compared to about 95% of whites, right? About 48% are in labor intensive or low status occupations compared to about 32% of whites. And then the hourly wage, and this should be log hourly wage, sorry about that, is about 2.6 compared to about 2.9, right? And so these things actually kind of go with what we would think that they should be, right? So this is just a map of my Confederate streets, all right? What does it look like, all right? And so this is actually just a heat map and just indexing how many streets do we actually see are named after Confederate generals. Remember that this is a lower bound. I went to, as Dr. Huda said, I went to LSU. Anyone who's been in Baton Rouge, we have Lee Drive, several of Lee's. It's not just Lee Drive, Lee Boulevard, Lee Avenue. We also, again, have Lee High School, which sits on Lee Drive. So remember that these are really underestimates, but what you're still seeing is a lot of streets named after Confederate generals. You're seeing that there ranges from 0 to 25, even with that lower bound estimate, right? And you're seeing that there's great variation. What I would say I would point out as well is notice that you're seeing a lot of streets named after Confederate generals in what some people would call the Deep South, right? Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, right? You're seeing a lot of these streets named after Confederate generals, right? So empirical framework. All right, so what am I doing here? This is a fancy way for economists to actually just say, hey, what am I estimating? I'm going to have, again, some measure of Confederate streets. All right, so I know how many of these Confederate streets are in an area. I also have individuals in my sample, and I know their race, I know their ethnicity, I know their country of birth. I know all these different things, but for the meantime, I'm going to actually only focus on Blacks who are American born, and I'm going to compare them to whites who are also American born, right? And the main thing I care about here is this beta 3 coefficient. This is actually going to tell me how Blacks and whites differ based on living in areas that have Confederate streets, right? How do they differ based on what? Again, those measures I talked about, employment status, whether or not they're in low status occupations, and their log hourly wages, right? Because I want to compare people, and again, I don't want to just throw people in there, right? I don't want to just say, compare this Black person compared to this white person. I want to make sure that they're comparable in some measure. And so I have a set of individual level covariates. What does that mean? I'm actually going to control for education, marital status, whether or not you're female, age, and its square, right? And so what this is actually going to do is make sure this whole funky looking thing, right, that I have here that looks probably crazy to some people. What this is really saying is that it wants to make sure that it's comparing Black individuals who have the same level of education, same marital status, women or men, right, same age, compared to whites who have those same characteristics, right? So again, not just randomly choosing Black and white people, but actually choosing Black and white people who have those same characteristics. And they want to see how their employment status, their occupation, and their wages differ based on Confederate Streets. That's a mouthful, but I hope everybody's still with me. All right, and then I have Puma level covariance. And so this is just where you live. And I'm looking at the median age of an area, the share that's married, the college experience, and a population density of an area. Right. So what do I find? So I'm going to first just walk through this piece right here, Black. All right. So this is actually, again, showing me how Blacks compare to whites. What this is actually saying is that Blacks are less likely to be employed, negative coefficient. They are more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and they have lower log wages compared to whites. Specifically, Blacks are about 1.3 percentage points less likely to be employed, about 16 percentage points, that's very high, more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and earn about 20% less in their hourly wages compared to whites, which is about on pattern on what we know. So this is something that we already know. Where is my research coming in here with this Confederate Streets, right? And again, I'm looking at the number instead of the mileage, but the results are robust to looking at that. What this is now saying is, okay, now I want to look at individuals who are Black, but who reside in these areas with Confederate Streets. And what this is actually telling me, for one additional Confederate Street per 1,000 total streets, all right, Blacks are less likely to be employed, more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and have lower hourly wages compared to their white counterparts. Right. So this whole overall table, what is this really saying? What it's saying is that we already know that Blacks have lower labor, worse labor market outcomes compared to whites. That's what this coefficient is telling me. But what this is actually telling me is, and on top of that, when they live in areas that have these Confederate Streets, they actually incur an additional labor market penalty in terms of their employment, in terms of their occupational status, in terms of their hourly wages. Again, for an additional Confederate street per 1,000 total streets, they earn about additional 4% less. So again, that's on top of the 20%, 4% less for each Confederate street. Right? But because I'm used to dealing with economists, and again, if you've ever dealt with economists, you'll know how they are. And that means that that's not enough, right? You show that table and they still go hocus pocus. Hocus pocus, you got to show me more. I need to know, right? So remember, I told you that I'm including education, right? That is actually just your educational attainment, right? Do you have a bachelor's degree? Do you have a high school diploma? Do you have a PhD? Stuff like that. But one thing that actually may differ greatly, even if Blacks have the same level of education, the quality of education may differ, right? And this is actually just because research has actually shown us that Blacks usually attend, especially when it comes to primary education, schools that actually have lower resources. And so it could be that they have different types of quality of education compared to whites, even though they may have the same education level, right? So what I'm gonna do is actually use a data from Carruthers and Wanamaker, and they actually have data, historical data from 1910 and 1940, and they have 8 metrics of school resources that they use. And this is actually for Blacks and whites. So they have the average teacher salary for Blacks, the average teacher salary for whites. They have the teachers per enrolled pupil for Black students, for white students. What I'm going to do is use that measure and assign an individual a quality of measure based on their area of residence, right? So if you live in New Orleans, what is the average quality of education that a Black person in New Orleans receives? What is the average quality of education that a white person receives in New Orleans, right? That's what this entire thing is doing. What do I see? So now notice I include this quality of education measure, and it goes in a way in which you would think. Higher quality of education, what do you see? You see that higher quality of education, more likely to be employed, less likely to be employed in low status occupations, and they have higher log hourly wages, right? So it makes sense. Better quality of education, better labor market outcomes. But the thing to take away from this is when I include this as a measure, guess what happens? The results still remain the same. Notice how, again, Blacks still, for an additional Confederate street, they are still less likely to be employed, more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and have lower log hourly wages compared to their white counterparts. Now the magnitude is reduced, is about 3.3%, again, but it's still incurring some labor market penalty, even when I include this qualitative education, right? But that's still not enough, right? Again, if you ever deal with economists, still not enough. They're like, nope, still don't believe you. We're gonna call it Mickey Mouse this time. Mickey Mouse hocus pocus stuff that you're doing. So remember, I'm talking about these Confederate symbols, right? And these Confederate symbols are related to historical events, right? So what if it's not the Confederate streets themselves, right? What if it's not them proxying current, the persistence of current racist policies that have negatively impacted Black folk? What if it's just the past, right? What if these areas that had Confederate symbols, they actually just are worse? They had more slavery, they had more lynchings, and those things actually have something to do with it. It's not necessarily Confederate symbols like I'm saying. So what am I doing now? Notice that my table is just growing and growing and growing, right? What I'm doing now is actually adding those things as controls, just to see what happens. Main thing, what do you want to take from this table? Main thing you want to take from this table is, again, still this first row. What do you still see? Same pattern. Blacks are still less likely to be employed, still more likely to be employed in low status occupations. And again, that log hourly wage is still about the same thing, still around 3 to 4%. So it still doesn't matter, even if I include all of these historical controls, you're still seeing this negative relationship. And I should say negative relationship, but this worse labor market outcomes in areas that have Confederate streets, right? But still not enough. What if it's geographic sorting? Right? I got this when I first started doing this research. Individuals said, okay, well, you're saying it's these Confederate streets, but people get to choose where they live, right? And so because they get to choose where they live, it might be that instead, right? It may not actually be these Confederate streets, but that Blacks who maybe had high employment propensities, that had higher wages, that they were more likely, to migrate away from these southern areas that were racist. And so what you have is a biased sample to some extent. And so I'm actually going to examine whether or not this is true by using two methods. First method, I'm going to restrict my sample to stayers. And so the data set that I have, I know where people live and where they were born. And so what I'm going to do is say, hey, well, those people didn't move. They didn't migrate into or out of, right? So there's no geographic sorting patterns for them. And so I want to see whether or not the results remain when I look at individuals who are quote unquote stayers. The second method I'm going to do is see whether or not Black migration rates differ for higher levels of Confederate streets. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. Right? So just looking at the first method, right? Going back against to my simplified table. Now what I'm doing is to some extent cutting my sample. And if anybody's been paying attention, if you look at my number of observations, they've been reduced. Why is that? Because remember, I'm only looking at individuals who currently reside in areas in which they were born, right? And I want to see, do I actually see the same patterns? Guess what I see? Same patterns. Less likely to be employed, more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and again, lower hourly wages. And if anything, it's actually increased, right? About 5% now. Right? What's my second method of geographic sorting? Second thing I want to do, I want to see whether or not patterns of migration are related to the number of Confederate streets in an area, right? And what I'm actually going to do is look at patterns from 1910 to 1980, right? And this is just because this is when the Great Migration started. And again, you did have a lot of Black individuals migrating away from southern areas. So I just want to see, okay, do we see that areas that had a higher number of Confederate streets, do we see that Blacks were more likely to migrate away from these areas? Right? Because if, in order for geographic sorting to be explained in my results, I would have to see that relationship. I would have to see that, again, looking at areas that have more Confederate streets, that Blacks are migrating away from these areas, right? What do I see? I have a figure here for people who are like, I'm tired of seeing tables, even though I'm about to show you tables again, unfortunately. All right, still got to do my econ stuff. What are these figures showing? These figures are actually showing what my point estimates are, right? What my regression results are giving me. What you should notice is that this line, this red line here, is 0. If I look at any decade, 1910, 20, 30, et cetera, all the way to 80, what are we seeing? we're seeing point estimates that are very, very close to zero, if not directly zero, right? And what are these bands? These bands are actually talking about statistical significance, right? These bands are actually telling me, hey, listen, there are no patterns of geographic sorting. We do not see, if I look at 1910, I do not see that individuals who lived in areas that had more Confederate streets, that they are migrating away from these areas. I don't see it in 1920. I don't see it in 1930. I don't see it in 1940. So what I'm actually showing is that if you actually look at the entire Great Migration period, you do not see that Blacks are migrating away from these areas that had more Confederate streets. And you would need to see that in order for geographic sorting to explain my results. All right, now, I've done all of that. So I've shown, okay, it's related. We see that there's worse labor market outcomes for Black individuals who live in these areas that have more Confederate streets compared to whites. All right, but there's more people in the world, we know, than just Black and white people. All right, come on, let's talk about that. Sometimes people pretend as if that's not the case. So what I want to see is whether or not these Confederate streets are actually a measure of distaste for others in general. So not just Blacks, but just a distaste for all non-whites, right? And again, this thinking builds upon if this is actually a way to connect the past and the present. And if these areas that actually had individuals who were racist, who had the power to name these streets, had the power to erect these monuments, all these different things, if they created racist policies, those policies probably extended to other minorities in general, not just Black individuals, right? And so the groups of minorities examined that I'm going to test are Hispanics, Asians, and foreign-born individuals. Why am I testing this subset? Because this is a subset that's in my data set, right? So I can actually identify individuals with Hispanic, and this is Hispanic American born, Asian American born, foreign born, right? In all races and ethnicities, right? So what do I have? And again, here we go back to the tables. Yes, for the people who hate tables, sorry, but they're here. Okay, we're still gonna do it. So my first column is actually, and for the next two tables as well, is gonna just show what's my relationship for Blacks compared to whites. Again, this is what we saw before. What are we saying for Hispanics? We're saying that Hispanics, again, also are less likely to be employed. Asian individuals. Now, these point estimates is a little bit higher, right? But it's very, very close to zero and statistically insignificant. And for foreign-born individuals, notice how we see it, they are also less likely to be employed. So what this is actually showing is that when we look at in terms of labor market outcomes, employment, whether or not an individual is employed, we see that for Blacks, for Hispanics, and for foreign-born individuals, that they are less likely to be employed when they live in these areas that have these Confederate symbols. All right, for Asians, we see that they are more likely, but very, very, very small and very close to zero and statistically insignificant. Now, what about occupation? Low status occupation in particular, right? Remember, the results show that Blacks were more likely to be in low status occupations. What do we see for Hispanics? We see for Hispanics, we see about a 6.2 percentage points more likely to be employed in low status occupations. For Asians, about 2 percentage points more likely to be employed. For foreign-born individuals, about 1 percentage point more likely to be employed. So notice how we're seeing a similar pattern across all the board for Blacks, Hispanics, Asian, and foreign-born individuals, right? We're actually seeing that they are all more likely to be employed in low status occupations when they live in areas that have more Confederate streets. And in particular, notice that the greatest magnitude is for those who are Hispanic, right? About 6.2 percentage points more likely to be employed in low status occupations. All right, wages, right? What everyone cares about, money, 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 right? What happens with money? And again, I wanted to stop here just to make sure I'm making the case that everybody gets this. Remember, I am not just picking a random Black person and a random white person, or a random Hispanic person and a random white person. Remember, I am actually conditioning on them having the same education level, same age, same marital status, and what else? Oh, cool. Oh, perfect. Same marital status. And I feel like there's one other thing I was forgetting. But the point is that I'm making sure that they have those same things. And on average, I'm comparing these individuals, right? So we have those same characteristics, but because they live in these areas with Confederate streets, they have different labor market outcomes. I want you to think about how mind-blowing that is. So again, what do we see for Blacks? About 4% lower wages compared to whites. For Hispanics, about 10% lower wages compared to whites. For Asians, about 11% compared to whites. And for foreign-born individuals, about 3.4% lower wages compared to whites. So notice again, seeing that similar pattern. Notice how we have negative, 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 negative. And we're seeing that for Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and foreign-born individuals, that we see that they actually have lower wages compared to similar white individuals who live in the same area. All right, so in conclusion, and just looking at my time, want to make sure, cool, perfect. In conclusion, what I'm showing is that Confederate streets are associated with, number one, a proxy for historical racial animus. What does that mean? That actually means that we can actually say that Confederate streets are now a proxy for racial animus, right? And if anything, they are the manifestation of the persistence of a proxy of historical racial animus, right? The next thing I would say is that we see that labor market differentials are different for Blacks and whites when they reside in these areas. Blacks are less likely to be employed, more likely to be employed in low status occupations, and have lower wages compared to their white counterparts. I show that this is unlikely to be driven from qualitative education, past events, or geographic sorting. And I also show that revolutionary streets and number streets, and I'll show it in this talk, but I can tell you this is another falsification exercise that I do, that these are not associated with labor market differentials. So I only see it with streets named after Confederate generals. So I don't see it with streets that are named 1, 2, 3, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th Street, or again, streets named after Revolutionary War commanders, right? And so again, all of this is actually putting together to say, hey, there is something going on in these areas. And what I eventually hope to do with this paper is to actually to be able to identify the policies that have outlived the politicians or the people in power that have helped create these differential labor market outcomes for Blacks and whites, but for other minorities in general and whites overall that live in these areas. And I know I have 50 minutes, 2 minutes to spare. And so with that, I'll conclude and thank you all. And so now I'll just back out of this and see if I have any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for that beautiful analysis and the correlation between these Confederate streets and the kind of people and lives that are lived in those neighborhoods. So I take it that this was, there was a scheme here. Is this correct?
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. For me, my research agenda totally builds out from my experience. And that's from being from New Orleans and living right off of Robert E. Lee Boulevard. Again, going to a school that was formerly named Beauregard. And so for me, I kept saying that there had to be a way to quantify these streets named after Confederate generals. Once I found out that there was a database, I said, okay, well, all I need to do now is come up with some type of conceptual framework, build in psychology, cultural economics, get my data, and prove my point that there is something going on with these areas that have these streets named after Confederate generals. So it's not, I wanted to say one thing, it's not that, you know, people ride down these streets and they become racist, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm definitely not saying that, right? What I'm saying is that people in power put these here. And if you have the power to do that, what else do you have the power to do? You probably have the power to create policies, narratives, let's be clear, about individuals who do not look like you, that outlive you. And so those things may actually affect individuals' labor market outcomes. And that's what we see.
Fascinating. We have just one comment from MD Galvin who says, bravo. And then Kate, would you like to read the next question?
Absolutely. So the next question is from Jeff Ward. Thanks for a great talk. Some hope that renaming these streets will help to dismantle structural racism, including differential labor market outcomes. Your research suggests that might not be the case in the short term, at least, given the ways you suggest the streets function as proxies for animus, and resentment may be reinforced by removal, at least in the short term. I know you haven't studied this specifically, but how do you think renaming will impact communities economically or otherwise?
Oh, great question. Oh God, great question. I get this. This is something I've had to think about for a long time because people have asked me, you know, kind of like what you're saying. In the short run, you're saying it's not going to really do anything. And the truth is, it's not. It probably won't. What I think that we have to have a bigger conversation about is what else is going on in these communities? That's the question, right? What I actually think, if anything, is that these symbols are actually telling us areas that we need to study. That's what they're telling us. They're telling us localities that may actually have racist laws on the books. And that's what we need to identify. And so for me, do I think that these things should be renamed? Of course, right? Of course, I think they should. But I think that it's bigger than just renaming. Renaming, changing. Again, a school that I went to name was Thurgood Marshall, but 2 years prior and before that, it was named Beauregard. Listen, it was a low resource school when it was named Beauregard. It was a low resource school after it was named Thurgood Marshall, right? So the question really is, will taking Beauregard down and replacing it with Thurgood Marshall make a change? No. The real thing is that why is it that schools that are named Beauregard, that are named Robert E. Lee, that are named whatever, why are they low resource schools? Why are they in Black communities? Why are they in communities of individual people of color in general? And what's going on with that? And so I think the bigger thing is to really say, let's look at the policies and actually try to undo the policies that have done this is the bigger thing than just renaming, I should say.
Again, just a reminder that please write your questions down, or if you don't want to write them down, at least raise your hand and we'll be happy to call on you. The next is a comment from, and I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, please forgive me, Chukwudi Unonu. He says, or she, no question, but I wanted to say thanks for sharing your work. Very deep and meaningful, and with continued support, socially impacting beyond these borders of our nation.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you. No, listen, for me, I'll tell you a story because I talk a lot, if you can't tell. I'll tell you a story. For me, I never really wanted to talk about race. And I hope that there's grad students on here who hear this. I never wanted to talk about race. I never wanted to be, and I know this sounds crazy, I never wanted to be the Black person who studied Black issues, because I always thought that people would undermine my intelligence. And I know that sounds crazy, right? That, oh, if I talk about that, it seems like I can't talk about anything else. And when I got to grad school, everything I thought about was race, everything. I mean, especially learning about economics. My entire mind just kept going, this has a racial element to it. This has a racial element to it. This has a, and so what I had to say to myself was, this is who you are. You were made to go to these schools that were formerly named Beauregard. You were made to live off of Robert E. Lee Boulevard, Beauregard Middle School. You were made to live off of Robert E. Lee. You were made to go to Xavier University, which was right off of Jefferson Davis in New Orleans, so that you could do this research. And so for me, it's really worthwhile. Like I love everything about it, and definitely hope to continue it, and definitely love doing this so I can inspire other people to do it as well.
Thank you. Kate, do you have a question?
I do. I was wondering about the political participation aspect of it as well, and whether, I think this follows on from Jeff's question about economic impacts that you might see, but have you seen any, or can you track impacts of political participation where streets have been named? There may be the negative backlash, but is there a positive as well?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So one positive, even looking at, say, a political aspect would be, say, like MLK's, right? Martin Luther King Boulevard, or even in DC, right? There's Malcolm X Boulevard. The issue that I've ran into, at least this is where I think a qualitative researcher would be much better than I would. And so if any qualitative researcher wants to partner with me, let me know. But the issue with quantitative research sometimes is that you have to have enough variation, right? You need to have enough counts to some extent. The issue with, say, for instance, looking at the reverse effects, say MLKs, there's only one MLK, right? There's only one Malcolm X, and that's if an area has it, right? You're doing good if you have an MLK. So you don't really have a lot of streets named after, say, civil rights leaders. But qualitatively, do I think that there's probably something going on? Oh, for sure. For sure. Do I think that we can interview individuals in these areas to see what's going on? Of course. I just can't do it only because the data won't allow me to do it. And that's the one thing that sucks sometimes about being quantitative. The data just stops it, and you can think that something's there, but you can't really push forward because of that.
Thank you. I have another question. So right now, of course, there's much greater awareness about not only monuments, but Confederate monuments and Confederate streets. But I'm wondering, from your research and just from all of your studies in this area, what is, do you think, the best way to have a more systematic approach of removing these symbols from our society?
Oh, we're going to need to do a lot of research, One thing that I think that people don't talk about a lot is we focus on, and I do, right, on Confederate symbols. But there's more than Confederate symbols, way more than Confederate symbols. And I say that because there's local heroes, I'll call them. So you have some individuals who are not Confederate generals, but that strongly believed in slavery, that strongly opposed integration, and it had power. So even like LSU, our library was named after a guy who was a big segregationist. I mean, totally opposed it even when LSU came, even to the point where he even said, hey, if those Black kids get in the pool, they know what's going to happen. And so LSU just changed the name of the library because of that. I just say that, to me, I think that systematically what we have to do is it's going to take more researchers. Like, I can't do this by myself, right? I cannot, because there's so many things that we can highlight, and so many different, I don't know if we want to call them bad actors or whatever, but individuals that have power, that have to some extent created these outcomes that we see today, which is extremely problematic.
Thank you for that. Other questions that anyone from the audience has? Don't be shy. This is the time. Ask your questions.
I think I'm not sure if participants can raise their hands right now. I'm trying to figure out if there's something stopping that happening. So if you can type your questions for now, and then I'm trying to fix the raise hand.
And I'll take some water since I've been talking all day.
Yes. No, I guess. Question from Malik Wilson. Can you talk about the ontological split between quantitative and qualitative?
Oh, yeah. So listen, I'm from New Orleans, so sometimes that ontological, I'm assuming the difference. I'm going to assume that's what that means. But if I'm not, come back into the QA and let me know. But yeah, qualitative and I'm assuming you're asking what's the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is numbers, data-driven, totally. So most of econ is quantitative, just because we need a lot of data to back up our stuff. Qualitative research instead is more of a I always think of it as words, right? So more doing surveys and actually talking to individuals. So you'll see things of like, you'll see individuals who do quantitative research. Again, I'll have, 1 million responses. People who do qualitative research may actually only have 5 responses, but they're getting a deeper understanding of what's going on. I'm giving more of a high level, on average, blah, 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 blah. I may not be able to get into the nuances, but someone who's qualitative can't interview 1 million people, right? Instead, they're going to actually maybe interview a small group of individuals and to get a deeper understanding of what's going on. And those two things together can be used very effectively. I work at RAND Corporation. I should say this work was not done at RAND, was not funded by RAND. This is outside academic work that I have. And a lot of things that we do at RAND uses mixed methods. And so a prime example I would give of that as well too is I do a lot of voting research, a lot of literature on voting. I would say that I am like the quantitative person for voting, right? Stacey Abrams is the qualitative person, right? She's the person that's actually getting out, understanding the issues. I'm the person that maybe am using the data to understand the issues and can give her some insights, and she can give me insights in a different way. And so they complement each other very well.
That's very helpful. And Malik Wilson follows up. He says, how to blend the two together?
Oh, great question. Oh, so this is what I would tell you. And again, if these are PhD students, which I mean, I don't know if you are or not, I love my PhD students, if you can't tell. It is challenging to blend the two, to be totally honest. And I would say that because the one thing I would say about academia to some extent is that you usually have a specialty, right? And so you get tenure, you specialize in that one area. At a lot of think tanks, that's not necessarily the case. You do a lot of stuff. And so I've learned more about qualitative research, not in my PhD program. I didn't learn anything about qualitative research in my PhD program, because again, you're only specializing in quantitative research and then applying it to some topic, versus with qualitative research, I've learned about it at my think tank. And that's because I have to work with a vast group of individuals and learning more about it. But I do believe that people who can do both, you're unique. Just like I say, I'm unique as an economist because I talk about racism. If you can actually master the skills of both of the two, come on, you're getting a job over me, unfortunately.
But you're suggesting that that is not frequently done. Is that right?
No. Not in my experience. I have not really seen people really do mixed methods. For the most part, people are using quantitative people or qualitative people. You rarely see people who do both methods.
Interesting. That's interesting. That's any other, okay. Kate, would you like to read the next one?
Yes, absolutely. And also, I cannot turn on the raise hand feature. I don't know where it is. But if anybody does have a question and they don't have or can't type it out quickly enough, please just type your name in the Q&A box and then I can turn on your microphone. But the next question is from Tiffany Razavi. Thank you for a great presentation. I appreciate the data and the clarity with which you have presented your work, including the tables. You mentioned the link from street names to labor outcomes through policies. I am curious about how you might be able to go about identifying those policies and apply a quantitative approach to study them and the connection with economic outcomes.
Oh, great question. Great question. I can tell you right now what I've been doing. Number one is to look at institutions and look at how they differ based on race. So remember I had one of my data sets was qualitative education. What I find is that areas that actually have a higher number of Confederate streets, that they have worse quality of education for Blacks. Well, why would that be, right? And so what you can do now is actually unpack education policy. You can actually see what is actually going on. Another thing that I'm doing as well is looking at arrest data, right? I want to actually see, do you actually see that there may be some bias in policing in our criminal justice system, right? As it's related to the criminal justice system. I'm sorry, as it's related to Confederate symbols. The last thing that I'm doing too is trying to connect it to segregation measures. It could be that, again, econ is really the study of resources, right? How they're distributed. Could it actually be that these areas that have Confederate streets, that they're highly segregated, right? And because they're highly segregated, segregation is connected to so many things that people I don't even think get. I think that they really just think about it like someone lives here, someone lives here. But no, it's not just living there. We're talking about the type of schools you go to. We are talking about the type of housing. We're talking about whether or not you're living in a food desert. We're talking about whether or not you have access to public transportation. We're talking about whether or not you have the opportunity to network with individuals, right? If you were to some extent over here and individuals are over here and all of the jobs over here and they know about the jobs over here, it's multi-layered is why I'm saying all of that. And so the way in which I'm going to look at this is looking at different differences in institutions. I want to look at segregation measures. I want to look at education policy. And I want to look at criminal justice policy as well to see whether or not they are related to Confederate streets.
I think we will stop it there. I think we've had you speak long enough and such a beautiful way of presenting your really quite creative research, I have to say. It's so refreshing to see not only the history, the psychology, and the economics of what you do in your work, and it's so appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Williams. It's really a pleasure to have you, and we hope that as you do additional research that perhaps we can have you back and learn more from other aspects of your research as well. But we really appreciate your joining us today and for your very excellent talk, which we have recorded, and it will go on our YouTube channel probably over the next couple of days. Yes. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to tell our audience that this today's lecture is the last one for our fall semester series, but come February, when we start our spring semester, we have our first, and as you know, February 2022 is Black History Month. So our first speaker, Dr. Jhacova Williams, will speak about civil rights and Black power movements on February 8th. So we hope you join us. And of course, you can get additional information about all of our events by going to our social media. So check our, join us on our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts, and access our website to see our future events. Thank you so much to all of you who joined us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in February. Bye-bye.